The first frost came early that year, silvering the tall grass before most men had even finished chinking their cabin walls. It crept low across the valley at dawn, turning wagon ruts into rigid scars and glazing the riverbank stones with a brittle shine. The men who had claims along Cottonwood Creek rose before light, breath fogging thick as chimney smoke, and stepped outside to test the ground with their boots. The soil rang faintly beneath their heels. Winter was rehearsing. Everywhere there was the hammering of urgency. Axes thudded into pine. Crosscut saws rasped in steady rhythm. Teams of mules dragged felled trunks toward half-built cabins. Smoke rose from cook fires where women boiled beans and salt pork, pausing only long enough to pass nails or hold a beam steady. The settlement had grown in a rush that summer raw timber boxes set into the land as if someone had shaken them from a crate and left them where they fell. No one pretended they were pretty. They only needed to stand and to hold heat. Inside most of those cabins, the floors were the same. Split planks laid hastily over skids or sleepers, gaps stuffed with rags or mud to block drafts. It was the fastest way. Cut trees, square them, roughly, lay them down. You could finish a floor in a day if the woodpile was ready and your hands were steady. A good plank floor meant you were serious. It meant you were here to stay. That was why the laughter started. At first it was only a remark made in passing, then a chuckle. Then, as the days shortened and the air sharpened, it grew louder, easier, more certain. Because while the rest of them were sawing and planing and pounding boards into place, Elias Mercer was hauling stones. Not small stones, either. Not pebbles a child might skip across water. He chose the heavy ones, the smooth, broad-backed river rocks that lay half-buried along the bend where the current slowed. He worked with a pry bar and a shovel, loosening each stone from the mud with care, levering it free with a grunt that echoed off the water. Then he would roll it inch by inch onto a wooden sledge he had built from scrap planks. Once the sledge was loaded, he tied a rope across his chest and leaned forward into the weight, boots slipping on damp grass, as he dragged the load up toward his claim. It was slow work. Slower than cutting wood, slower than stacking hay, slower than anything a man with winter at his heels ought to be doing. "You building a bridge in there, Mercer?" Someone called one morning as Elias hauled another sled past the nearest cabin. Elias paused only long enough to shift the rope higher on his shoulder. "Building a floor?" he answered. The reply brought a bark of laughter. "You planning to keep cattle inside with you?" More laughter. Someone spat into the dirt. Elias did not answer again. He set his jaw and leaned into the rope until the sledge scraped forward. His cabin stood a little apart from the others, not out of rudeness, but because the creek curved that way and he had chosen higher ground. The structure itself was nearly finished, 4 walls of squared pine logs notched tight at the corners, roof pitched steep and shingled with split cedar. The chimney was stone, carefully laid, rising stout and square against the autumn sky. From a distance it looked no different from any other claim house in the valley. It was only when you stepped inside that you saw the difference. Where most cabins smelled of fresh sap and sawdust, his smelled of damp earth and river clay. The ground inside had been dug down nearly a foot below the door frame. Elias had spent 3 days with shovel and pick, carving out a shallow basin the size of the main room. The removed soil lay piled behind the cabin in a dark mound. In its place, he had tamped the earth flat and hard, then layered it with a mixture of clay and sand hauled from the creek bank. And over that stone. He laid each rock by hand. He tested them for wobble, adjusting their angle, pressing them down until they sat firm and close against their neighbors. The stones fit together in an uneven mosaic, pale gray and mottled brown, smoothed by years of water, insistence. When one did not suit, he set it aside and chose another. He filled gaps with smaller fragments, tapping them into place with the butt of his hammer. By lantern light, the floor glistened faintly as if the river still clung to it. On the afternoon, the frost lingered past noon. 3 men wandered over under the pretense of neighborliness. They stamped their boots on the threshold before entering, though the habit was unnecessary. There were no planks to dirty, no boards to scratch. They stood just inside the doorway and stared down. "Lord above," muttered Henry Collins, nudging a rock with his toe. "You serious about this?" Elias straightened from where he had been kneeling. A smear of clay streaked his cheek. "Serious as a coffin." "You will freeze your feet clean through," said another. "Stone holds cold." "Don't holds," Elias replied evenly. They exchanged glances. The youngest of them crouched and pressed his palm against one of the rocks. "Feels like a gravestone," he said. "That's so," Elias answered. There was an edge to his voice that might have cut deeper if he had raised it. But he did not. He simply returned to his work, fitting another stone into the pattern. The men lingered, unsure whether to continue the mockery or retreat with dignity. Finally, Collins shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. "But when the first snow hits, you will wish you delayed timber like the rest of us." Elias did not look up, we'll see. They left shaking their heads. The truth was, Elias knew exactly what they saw when they looked at his floor. They saw wasted time. They saw a man distracted by some foolish notion while the season turned against him. They saw aching backs and empty woodpiles and a cabin that, by their reckoning, would suck heat from a fire like a hungry mouth. What they did not see was the memory that had followed him west from Pennsylvania. He had grown up in a stone farmhouse built by his grandfather. The walls were thick enough that the windows seemed set in tunnels. In winter, his mother would stoke the hearth from dawn until dusk. The flagstone floor in the kitchen would warm slowly, almost imperceptibly, until by evening it held the day, as fire in its bones. After supper, when the flames died down to embers, the house did not surrender its heat all at once. It released it gently through the night. He remembered waking before sunrise and padding barefoot across stone that was cool, yes, but never cruel, never biting. He had learned then that stone was patient. Wood flared and faded. It took flame eagerly and gave it up just as eagerly. It cracked, shrank, let in drafts. Stone endured. It absorbed. It gave back slowly. When he reached the valley that spring and staked his claim, he had walked the creek bed with that memory alive in him. He had crouched and run his hand across the smooth backs of river rocks, feeling their weight, their density. He had thought of the long nights that would come, of wind howling down from the mountains, of snow pressing against walls, and he had decided, now, as October deepened, and the settlement. Laughter sharpened with the cold. He worked from first light to dusk, hauling and laying until his shoulders burned and his fingers split at the knuckles. He ate quickly, slept hard, and rose again. Children began to trail behind him on his trips to the creek, curious and unafraid to stare. One little girl asked why he did not simply cut boards like her father. "Because boards burn," he told her. "So do rocks," she said, wrinkling her nose. He smiled faintly. "Not the way you think." Her father called her back before she could ask more. By mid-October, the floor covered half the cabin. The stones formed a pale sea beneath the rough-hewn table he had built against one wall. His iron stove stood near the center, pipe snaking upward into the chimney. He had positioned it carefully, measuring the room with a length of twine, imagining how heat might move across the space. He kept these thoughts to himself. Words would not convince men who trusted only what they could see in the span of a single day. The wind changed one night, sweeping down from the north with a sharpness that bit through wool. Elias lay awake listening to it probe the corners of his cabin. The walls held. The roof did not groan. Beneath him, the unfinished portion of the floor was still bare earth, cool against the soles of his feet when he rose to stir the fire. He stood there in the dark, feeling the difference between packed soil and stone, committing it to memory. He would finish in time. The next morning, frost did not melt at all. The settlement gathered near the well at noon, stamping and blowing into their hands. Talk turned from harvest yields to firewood stacks. Men compared cords as if counting coins. There was pride in a high pile, in neatly split logs stacked tight against a wall. Elias, as woodpile was modest by comparison, spent all his time dragging rocks, someone said under his breath. Elias heard. He bent to draw water without comment. In truth, his woodpile worried him. Not because it was small, but because it was not yet what he intended. He had calculated roughly, from memory and instinct, how much he would need if his plan worked. Less than the others, certainly, but still enough to start the cycle each day. He returned to the creek that afternoon with renewed urgency. The ground along the bank had hardened, making each stone more difficult to free. He used the pry bar until his palms blistered anew. When at last he dragged the loaded sledge toward home, the rope cut into his shoulder through 2 layers of wool. Henry Collins watched from a distance, arms folded. "You'll kill yourself before the snow does," he called. Elias stopped, chest heaving. He looked back across the field. "Better that than freeze foolish," he answered. The remark drew a murmur from 2 other men nearby. Collins flushed, but did not reply. By the time the first thin snow fell a powdering that melted by afternoon, Elias had covered nearly 3/4 of the floor. The pattern of stone was irregular but tight, each piece locked against its neighbor. He had begun to fill the seams with a slurry of fine sand and clay, brushing into cracks, then misting it with water so it would settle and harden. The surface, once uneven and shifting, grew firmer underfoot. One evening, as the sky burned orange and then purple behind the tree line, Elias stood in the doorway and looked back at his work. The cabin smelled of clay and smoke. The stones caught the firelight in dull glints. It was not pretty in the way of polished floors back east. It was rough, honest, elemental. He imagined January. He imagined a night when the wind would claw at the walls and the chimney would moan. He imagined neighbors waking to feed their fires again and again, wood dwindling by the hour. He imagined his own stove glowing steady, the stones beneath it drinking in the heat. He did not smile. He was not a man given to outward triumph. But something in his chest settled. The laughter had not stopped entirely. It followed him in small ways, a shake of the head, a muttered comment when he passed. Yet there was also now a thread of curiosity woven through it. Men who had mocked outright now asked quieter questions. How many you hauled so far? Don, do you get tired of it? Think it'll really make a difference? Elias answered simply, it will. On the last clear day before the real cold set in, he laid the final stone. It was broader than most, nearly oval, and he had saved it for the center of the room. He set it carefully into place, pressed down with both hands, and felt it settle solid against the clay bed. Then he sat back on his heels and exhaled long and slow. The floor was complete. Outside, the valley held its breath. The grass had gone brittle. The creek ran low and sharp-edged between banks already stiffening with frost. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray lines that drifted eastward. Elias built a small fire that evening, not the roaring blaze of desperation, but a steady, measured burn. He fed the stove one log at a time, watching the iron glow faintly. The heat spread outward in invisible waves. He could feel it on his shins, on his face. Then he did something none of the others would have thought to do. He lay flat on his back on the stone floor, arms outstretched, cheek pressed against the rock. At first it was cool, even cold. The day's chill still clung to the surface. But as the fire burned on, as the hours passed and the stove radiated its steady warmth, the temperature beneath him shifted. Slowly, gradually. The stone no longer leached heat from his skin. It began to meet it halfway. He closed his eyes. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a dog barked and was hushed. A gust of wind rattled a loose shutter on a neighboring cabin. Laughter drifted faintly across the field. Men gathered around their plank floors, boots propped near open flames, congratulating themselves on work done quickly and sensibly. Elias remained where he was, feeling the quiet exchange between fire and stone beneath him. The night deepened. The fire settled to embers. Still he lay there, listening to the soft ticking of cooling iron and the faint sigh of wind along the roofline. They had called him foolish, wasteful, slow. He did not resent them for it. On the frontier, speed often meant survival. Tradition meant safety. Anything that strayed too far from the known invited suspicion. But winter would come regardless of opinion, and when it did, the river rocks beneath his cabin would remember every flame that touched them. The day after he finished the last row of stones along the western wall, Elias rose before dawn and stepped barefoot onto the river rock floor. The chill was honest, not cruel like the surface of a pond before it learns the language of ice. He stood there a moment, feeling the faint memory of last night. His fire still trapped in the deeper layers. It was not warmth yet, not fully, but it was promise. Outside, the settlement was already awake. The sound of axes came in steady pulses, echoing through the thin air. The men were cutting deeper into their winter woodpiles now, determined to stack enough to outlast whatever the mountains decided to send down. Smoke from breakfast fires drifted low and flat, pressed by a north wind that carried the scent of snow. Elias did not reach for his axe. Instead, he pulled on his boots, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped out with his rope and sledge. By now the path between his cabin and the creek had become a scar through the brittle grass. The ground was stiff underfoot, and the frost clung stubbornly to the shaded patches. He walked it without hurry, conserving his breath for the work ahead. He had already laid a full floor of stone, but the task was not complete, not in his mind. The others believed the foolishness had ended with the last rock set in place. They were wrong. At the creek bend, the water moved slower now, thinned by the season. It whispered over stones that gleamed in pale morning light. Elias crouched and ran his hand across them as he had done so many times before. He did not choose randomly. Each stone had a purpose. Flat backs, dense cores. No cracks that might split under heat. No crumbly edges that would crumble into dust. He tested weight with both hands before committing to the pry bar. Some were too light sedimentary layers that would hold little and give less. Others were too rounded, likely to shift even when packed tight. He set those aside. He selected stones like a man choosing livestock, measured, deliberate, a voice carried across the bank behind him. You building a second cabin under the first. Elias did not need to turn to recognize Henry Collins. The man had a way of standing as if every field belonged to him, just gathering what the river is giving. Elias answered. Henry stepped closer, boots crunching frost. He looked at the half-loaded sledge and shook his head slowly. You already filled your floor. I saw it. I did. Then what is this for? Elias wedged the pry bar beneath a broad slab and leaned his weight against it. The stone shifted with a sucking sound as mud released it. "Refinement," he said. Henry snorted. "Refinement? In a log cabin?" Elias rolled the stone onto the sledge and straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You refine what keeps you alive." Henry studied him for a moment, as if searching for a joke that won't stay there. Finding none, he spat into the creek and turned back toward his claim. By midday, Elias had hauled another load uphill. He did not bring these stones inside immediately. Instead, he stacked them along the cabin, as northern wall, sorting them into rough groups by thickness and breadth. The interior floor was solid now, but it was not level in every place. Some stones sat higher than others. Some seams remained wider than he liked. He knelt and ran his hands across the surface, feeling for wobble, listening for hollow sounds beneath. A plank floor could hide its weaknesses beneath boards. Stone could not. It demanded patience. He pried up 3 stones near the stove and set them aside. From the new stack he chose thicker pieces, sliding them into place and tapping them down with a mallet until they sat tight. He filled gaps with finer gravel and sand, brushing the mixture deep into the seams. Then he tamped again. The work was quiet, meditative. Outside, axes still rang. Inside, only the muted thud of stones settling into earth. Toward afternoon, the cabin door creaked open without a knock. It was Samuel Reed this time, hat in hand, cheeks red from cold. "You aiming to pave the whole territory?" Samuel asked lightly. Elias did not look up, just my square of it. Samuel stepped carefully across the stones, testing them under his boots. Fees like a stable floor. It won teat rot. Neither will dirt. Dirt shifts, holds damp, breathes cold. Samuel crouched and pressed his palm against the surface. Cold, that's exactly what this feels like. Elias stood and brushed grit from his knees. For now. Samuel tilted his head. "You keep saying that." Elias walked to the stove and laid his hand against the iron flank. It was cool. He had not lit it yet that day. "You ever sit against a boulder at dusk in summer?" he asked. Samuel frowned slightly. "Can't say I've made a habit of it. They hold the day, as sun." Elias continued, long after the lights, gone. Samuel shrugged. "This ain't summer." "No," Elias agreed quietly. "It is." Samuel rose and moved toward the door. "Well, you are welcome to your rocks," he said. "Just on. Come begging for split pine when your toes go numb." Elias allowed himself the faintest smile. "I won, tea." After Samuel left, Elias closed the door firmly and barred it against the wind. He moved to the woodpile and selected 2 modest logs, not the thickest, not the smallest. Enough to wake the stove but not to roar. He placed them carefully, struck flint, and coaxed flame into life. The fire caught, hesitated, then strengthened. Elias did not sit in a chair as most men would. He lowered himself directly onto the stone floor near the stove, cross-legged, and watched the iron glow deepen from black to dull red. Heat spilled outward in invisible waves. He waited. At first, nothing seemed different from any other cabin. The air warmed, his hands thawed. The scent of burning pine filled the room. But as the minutes passed, Elias placed his palm flat against the nearest stone. Cold. He waited longer. The fire settled into steady burn, not consuming the logs too quickly. Elias adjusted the damper to control the draft. He knew that a wild blaze would heat the air fast and escape just as fast. What he wanted was sustained exchange. He remained seated for nearly an hour, occasionally shifting position, occasionally rising to stir the fire. When at last he pressed both palms flat to the stones, he felt the slightest change not on the surface, but deeper. A muted warmth, as if something beneath the visible layer had begun to stir. He nodded once. By evening, when the sky darkened and wind scraped against the cabin walls, the stones nearest the stove were undeniably warm. Not hot enough to burn. Not even hot enough to call comfortable, but warmer than the air above them. Elias let the fire die earlier than his neighbors would have dared. He allowed it to settle into coals, then into embers. He did not feed it again. Instead, he banked the ash lightly and lay down on his bed in the corner, boots off, ears tuned to the night. Hours passed. The wind strengthened, rattling shutters and pressing against chinks between logs. In other cabins, flames would be climbing again by now, devouring fresh logs to fight the encroaching cold. Elias slid from his bed and crossed the room barefoot. The air had cooled, yes. But when he stepped onto the stone near the stove, he felt it the slow release. The warmth stored in the dense rock was rising gently, bleeding upward into the space. He stood there in darkness, letting his feet measure what his mind had predicted. It was not dramatic. It was not miraculous. It was steady. The next morning, frost rimed the inside edges of his window frame, but the floor beneath him did not bite. He bent and touched it again, still holding. Outside, the settlement buzzed with new urgency. A rumor had drifted down from a trader passing through. Heavy snow already blanketed the higher passes. Winter would not delay. Men split wood with renewed force. Children were sent to gather kindling. Women mended woolens and sealed food stores. The valley braced. Elias returned to the creek again, that day not for the main floor this time, but for the perimeter. He intended to line the base of the interior walls with a shallow ridge of stone, thickening the mass around the cabin. Edge where drafts most often crept. When Henry saw him dragging another load, he laughed openly. "You planning to bury yourself in there, planning not to freeze?" Elias replied. "You think a pile of rocks beats a cord of oak. I think it uses less." That drew a sharper look. "Less?" Elias stopped the sledge and met Henry's eyes. "How many cords you stacked?" "6. And how long you expect that to last?" Henry hesitated. "All winter if I am careful. If you were careful." Elias repeated softly, "If the wind is kind. If the snow dawn to trap you from cutting more." Henry bristled. "And you think I'll do better with that?" He jerked his chin toward the stones. "I think I'll do different." Henry shook his head, muttering something about stubborn fools. Inside, Elias set the new stones along the cabin. Inner edge, building a low border against the log walls. He packed clay tightly behind them, sealing cracks where cold air might creep in low. He worked until his fingers stiffened from damp soil, then lit the stove again and watched as the added mass absorbed heat. Day by day, he refined small things. He adjusted the stove's position by inches. He widened the hearth base with flat stones to extend the heat zone. He even placed a shallow tray of sand beneath the stove. Legs to prevent direct contact from scorching one spot too quickly. Neighbors noticed the smoke from his chimney burned shorter hours than theirs. Some interpreted that as foolish thrift, others as a sign he had already surrendered to cold. Yet none stepped inside long enough to observe carefully. One evening, as the first true snowfall drifted down in slow, deliberate flakes, Samuel returned, this time with a quieter expression. "You got a minute?" he asked. Elias gestured him in. Snow clung to Samuel's shoulders as he stepped across the threshold. He removed his hat and stamped his boots lightly. "Fees different," Samuel admitted after a pause. The fire in Elias' stove was modest, 2 logs only. Yet the air in the cabin held steady warmth, not the wild surge and fade common elsewhere. Samuel crouched and touched the stones again. "They are warm." "They were warmer earlier," Elias said. "They'll be warmer again tomorrow." Samuel sat back on his heels. "You really think this'll carry you through the long nights?" Elias considered before answering. "It won't carry me alone. I still need wood, but it'll stretch what I've got." Samuel nodded slowly, as if the concept was settling somewhere deeper than pride. Outside, laughter drifted faintly from another cabin, men dismissing what they did not yet understand. Inside, Elias fed one more small log into the stove and watched as flame licked iron. The floor beneath him no longer felt like a grave marker. It felt like a battery. He knew the others believed stone only stole heat. They had stood barefoot on frozen ground too many times to imagine otherwise. But they had never given stone time. They had never fed it slowly, steadily, allowed it to drink, and then return. As snow thickened outside, and the valley grew quieter under its white cover, Elias settled onto the floor once more, back against the stove. Sighed. He pressed his palm flat to the rock and closed his eyes. Let them laugh. Winter would answer. The first hard freeze did not announce itself with drama. There was no warning bell, no sudden whiteout sweeping down the valley at midday. It arrived quietly in the night, settling over the settlement like a verdict. Elias woke before dawn to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No creak of wagon wheels, no low murmur of cattle. Even the creek beyond his cabin seemed hushed, its usual murmur reduced to a thin, brittle whisper beneath forming ice. He lay still for a moment beneath his wool blanket, listening to his own breathing. The air in the cabin had cooled during the night, but it had not turned sharp. It rested somewhere between chill and comfort, cool enough to sting the nose slightly, yet not cruel enough to send him scrambling for flint. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and set his bare feet onto the stone floor. Cold met him first, surface cold, the kind that lives on top of things. But beneath it, there was something else. A steadiness. The memory of last evening, fire lingering deep within the stones like a low, patient heartbeat. He stood there longer than necessary, testing it. Outside, frost had claimed the world. When he unlatched the door and stepped into the dim blue of early morning, his breath burst into thick white clouds. The grass lay flattened under a glaze of ice. Fence rails shimmered silver. Even the woodpile looked brittle. each split log edged in crystal. From the neighboring cabins came the frantic sounds of rekindling metal pokers, clanging against stove grates, the hurried scrape of kindling tossed into iron mouths. Smoke rose fast and thick from chimneys, dark against the pale sky. The freeze had come hard and deep. Elias stepped back inside and closed the door firmly. He knelt before his stove and brushed aside the ash. Beneath it, faint red embers still glowed weak but alive. He added a small piece of pine and blew gently. Flame caught with surprising ease. He did not feed the stove greedily. He had no need to chase warmth as if it were fleeing. Instead, he laid one measured log atop the growing flame and adjusted the damper until the burn steadied. Then he did something no one else in the valley would have thought to do on such a morning. He lay down flat on the stone floor, his cheek pressed against the surface, his palms spread wide, his ear close enough to hear the faint, almost imperceptible tick of iron warming. At first, the topmost layer of rock felt cool against his skin. But as minutes passed and the stove, as heat radiated outward, the change began not sharply, not dramatically, but gradually, like dawn replacing night. The stones closest to the stove warmed first. He could trace the invisible boundary where cold ended and mild warmth began. He shifted slightly, following the edge with his fingertips. Further out, the rocks remained neutral, neither cold nor warm, but waiting. He smiled faintly. Outside, voices rose. Colder than I've ever felt. Water bucket froze solid. Firewood tea catch. The valley, which had laughed at him only weeks before, now fought against the season with visible strain. By mid-morning, the wind joined the freeze. It came down from the north, cutting between cabins, slipping beneath doors, probing at chinks in log walls. Chimneys smoked harder as fires were fed aggressively. Men who had boasted of their woodpiles now split additional logs, sweat freezing at their temples despite the cold. Elias fed his stove another modest piece of wood and watched the iron glow deepen to a dull red. He did not build a roaring blaze. He kept the fire steady, controlled. The difference between his cabin and the others was subtle at first. If someone had stepped inside briefly, they might not have noticed. The air was warm, yes, but so it was elsewhere. What they would not have felt in that first glance was the way the warmth did not hover only near the ceiling or cluster tightly around the stove. It moved, slowly, evenly. By afternoon, the freeze intensified. The creekus edges locked solid. Cattle huddled in tight circles near barns. Snow began to fall not heavy, but steady, dry flakes that whispered against window panes and collected along the cabinet's roofline. Elias stood barefoot once more on his stone floor and observed carefully. The rocks nearest the stove now held unmistakable warmth. When he pressed his palm flat against them, he could leave it there, without discomfort. Further out, across the center of the room, the stones were cool but no longer icy. He stepped closer to the far wall, where wind pressed hardest. Even there, the cold had softened. Late in the afternoon, a sharp knock rattled his door. He opened it to find Samuel Reed standing stiffly in the falling snow, cheeks flushed raw from wind. "You keeping warm?" Samuel asked without greeting. "Come in," Elias replied. Samuel stepped inside and immediately paused. His boots scraped lightly against the stone. He removed his gloves and flexed his fingers near the stove. "Fire smaller than mine," he muttered, glancing at the modest blaze. "It is." Samuel looked around slowly, as if trying to detect some hidden mechanism. "But it feels," he hesitated. "Steady?" Elias offered. Samuel nodded reluctantly. He crouched and placed his hand flat against the stone floor. His eyebrows rose. "It's warm." "Closer to the stove, yes." Samuel shifted his hand outward, testing different spots. "Not freezing, even here." "No." Samuel sat back on his heels. "Main goes cold the moment the fire dips. Whole place turns sharp in an hour." Elias shrugged lightly. "Stone takes time." "And gives time," Samuel said softly. They both fell silent for a moment, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. Samuel rose. "Henry's already burned through half a cord since dawn," he said quietly. "Swears the cold us eating it." Elias added another small log to the stove. "Cold eats what? It's offered fast." Samuel studied the iron door as flame flared briefly inside. "You're not worried about running out?" Elias shook his head once. "Not tonight." Samuel lingered another minute, then nodded to himself and left without further comment. As evening settled, the valley grew quieter not from peace, but from exhaustion. Fires roared in neighboring cabins, then were stoked again when they faltered. Chimneys belched heavy smoke into the frozen air. Elias allowed his own fire to burn steady until just after sunset. Then deliberately he stopped feeding it. The iron stove glowed faintly in the dim light. The last log cracked and settled inward, flame shrinking to a concentrated core. He adjusted the damper to slow the draft further, stretching the burn. He waited until only embers remained. Then he stood and crossed the room barefoot. The air had cooled slightly but not sharply. He could still breathe without seeing thick plumes before his face. He pressed his foot onto the stone near the stove. Warm. Not hot, not blazing, but warm. He walked slowly outward, step by step. The center of the room was cooler, yet far from icy. The stones beneath his weight felt dense, alive with stored energy. They did not surrender their heat instantly the way iron would. He extinguished the last faint glow in the stove and let darkness take the cabin. Hours passed. The wind howled stronger now, rattling shutters and forcing snow into drifts against the door. In other cabins, men rose repeatedly through the night to feed fires that refused to hold. Woodpiles shrank under the relentless demand. Sparks leapt from chimneys into the black sky. Elias lay awake for a time, listening. He felt the slow change in temperature, not a plunge, but a gradual easing downward. He rose once near midnight and stepped again onto the stone. Still warm, less than before, yes, but far from cold. He crouched and laid both palms flat on the floor. The warmth now seemed to rise from deeper layers, subtle but persistent. The mass of stone, having absorbed heat for hours, was giving it back reluctantly, resisting the cold that pressed from outside. He returned to bed without relighting the fire. Toward dawn, the cold reached its peak. Frost feathered the inside of the window frame. The air in the cabin felt undeniably cool but not punishing. When Elias finally rose at first light, he did so without the frantic stiffness he had seen in other winters back east. He stepped onto the stone and paused, cool, but not biting. He smiled to himself. Outside, the settlement bore signs of strain. Smoke rose thick and constant from chimneys. Men moved slower, conserving energy. Woodpiles that had seemed generous now showed visible gaps. Snow lay ankle-deep, and the wind had sculpted drifts against the leeward sides of cabins. Henry Collins stood outside his own door, splitting wood with heavy strokes, jaw tight. Elias approached quietly. "Cold enough for you?" Henry muttered without looking up. "It is." Henry drove the axe down again. "Burned near 2 full stacks since yesterday?" Elias nodded. Henry finally looked up. "You? Less." Henry's eyes narrowed. "How much less?" Elias considered before answering. "Half." Henry stared at him. "Don't lie," he said flatly. "I am not." Henry glanced toward Elias's cabin, then back at his own dwindling pile. For the first time since autumn began, doubt flickered across his expression. "You were telling me those rocks are doing this?" he asked quietly. "I'm telling you they were helping?" Henry looked away, jaw working. That afternoon, the cold did not relent. It deepened. Snow fell thicker, driven sideways by wind that howled like an animal along the valley floor. Doors froze shut. Water buckets turned solid within hours. The world narrowed to the size of each cabin's interior. Inside his own walls, Elias built another measured fire. He fed it carefully, allowing the stove to radiate steady heat into the stones. He watched how the warmth spread this time faster now, as the rocks had not fully surrendered yesterday, stored energy. The baseline temperature of the floor had risen slightly overall. It did not begin from deep cold. He knelt and placed a small iron kettle directly onto a flat stone near the stove's edge. After some time, the water inside warmed not from flame, but from the stone beneath it. He nodded once. Night came again, harsher than before. Across the valley, wood was consumed at alarming pace. Flames roared high into chimneys as men tried to overpower the freeze with sheer intensity. Elias did the opposite. He kept his fire modest and sustained through evening, allowing the stones to drink fully. Then once more, he let the flames die early. He stood in the dim cabin and removed his boots. He walked slowly across the floor. Warmth greeted him, not fierce, not blazing, but present. The stones radiated upward like a slow exhale. He lay down on his back, staring at the ceiling beams silhouetted faintly in moonlight filtering through frost-laced glass. The wind battered the walls. Snow piled high outside. But beneath him, the river rock floor held its ground. And for the first time since the settlement had begun to laugh at him, Elias felt something shift not in the stones, not in the air, but in the balance between doubt and proof. Winter had arrived, and the floor was answering. By the 4th day of the freeze, the valley had settled into a new rhythm, one dictated not by daylight or habit, but by fire. Cabins no longer woke gently. They jolted awake in the dark to the clatter of stove doors and the urgent crack of kindling. Men who once prided themselves on efficiency now fed flames like gamblers throwing coin onto a table. hoping heat would hold long enough to justify the cost. Elias rose that morning without hurry. The air in his cabin was cool, but it did not bite. Frost had etched delicate veins along the inside edge of the window pane, and a thin ribbon of cold hovered near the ceiling, but the space at ground level felt steady-tempered. He stepped barefoot onto the stone. Cool, yes, but not lifeless. He had begun to notice something subtle. The floor no longer returned fully to its original cold state between burns. Each day of steady heating had shifted the baseline upward. The massive stone had absorbed more than the immediate warmth of a single fire. It had accumulated. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the center of the room. There was again that low, hidden warmth beneath the surface layer. Outside, wind scraped across snowdrifts hardened into ridges. Chimneys exhaled thick columns of smoke. The valley looked smaller under its white burden, cannons hunched like shoulders against the cold. Elias knelt by his stove and opened the iron door. The ash bed was shallow. He had not fed the fire heavily the night before. Beneath gray dust, faint embers pulsed like dim stars. He stirred them gently, added a small piece of split pine, and watched flame catch without resistance. He did not rush to load the stove. He waited. The first principle he had learned through observation was not intensity, it was duration. Heat applied slowly and consistently allowed the stones to absorb energy deeply rather than merely warming the air. When the initial log caught fully, he added another, then adjusted the damper to reduce the draft. The fire settled into a steady burn, no roaring, no snapping sparks against the stove door. He stood and walked slowly across the cabin, feeling the change begin again. The warmth radiating from iron moved outward in invisible waves. Unlike wood planks, which would warm quickly and cool just as quickly, the stones responded with patience. They did not flare. They did not surrender heat at the slightest shift in air. They held. Late that morning, Samuel Reed returned, hat pulled low, beard frosted white. "You studying that floor like it, as a map?" Samuel observed as he stepped inside. "In a way," Elias replied. Samuel removed his gloves and crouched near the stove. "Explain it," he said quietly. Elias did not smile. Instead, he crouched opposite Samuel and placed his hand on the stone between them. "When you set a pot over flame," he began, "the iron heats first. Quick, you can touch it long." Samuel nodded. "But the stone hearth beneath it warms slower." "True. And when you pull the pot away, the iron cools fast. The stone does not." Samuel studied the floor thoughtfully. Elias continued. "Heat moves from what is hotter to what is cooler, always. The air near the stove warms quick because it has light. But it rises, escapes toward the roof. The floor stays cold if it has wood or dirt no weight to it." He tapped a stone with his knuckle. "This holds weight, density. It takes longer to heat, but once it does give it up all at once." Samuel leaned back slightly. "So you are restoring it?" Elias nodded. "Like water behind a dam." Samuel's gaze sharpened. "And when the fire dies, it releases slow." Samuel looked around the cabin as if seeing it differently now. "So instead of fighting the cold every hour, I feed the floor." Samuel gave a low whistle. Henry wouldn't like hearing that. "He doesn't have to." Samuel reached down and pressed his palm flat again. "Fee's warmer than yesterday." "It is." "How?" "'Cause it did. Start from nothing this morning." Samuel absorbed that quietly. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling loose shingles and forcing snow against doors in thick, powdery sheets. The settlement's fires burned brighter in response. Smoke grew heavier, hanging low in the frozen air. By afternoon, Elias's cabin held a steady warmth at ground level even though his stove burned modestly. He had begun to test variations, slightly adjusting the damper to lengthen burn time, spacing logs farther apart, measuring how the stone responded. He noted patterns. When he fed the stove heavily for a short burst, the air temperature spiked quickly, but the stones only warmed near the surface. The effect faded sooner once flame died. When he burned low and steady for hours, the stones warmed deeper. Even after the air cooled, the floor radiated upward long into the night. He had become a student of his own cabin. That evening, Henry Collins appeared at the door without knocking. He entered stiffly, boots scraping stone. "Reed has been talking," Henry said, "about your rocks." Elias stood from where he had been kneeling by the stove. Henry crossed the room slowly, testing the floor with deliberate steps. "Fee's different," he admitted reluctantly. Elias said nothing. Henry crouched and placed both hands flat against the stone near the center. His eyes narrowed. "It's warm clear out here." "Yes." Henry glanced at the stove. "You ain't burning near as much as me." Henry stood abruptly and paced once across the room. How long's it hold after you stop? Through the night. Henry stared at him. All night? He demanded. Most of it. Henry's jaw tightened. Pride and practicality wrestled visibly across his face. You saying I should tear up my floor? He asked finally. Elias shook his head slowly. I am saying stone remembers. Henry exhaled sharply through his nose. Wood dawn, tea. Henry stood in silence for several long moments, boots grinding lightly against the surface. Then, without another word, he turned and left. As the door shut, Elias returned to the stove and fed it one more small log. He did not feel triumph. He felt confirmation. Night deepened, bringing the coldest temperatures yet. The valley groaned under it. Timber contracted and popped sharply. Snow crust hardened into brittle sheets. Inside his cabin, Elias allowed the fire to burn steady until late evening. Then he stopped. He watched the final flames diminish into embers, then into faint glow beneath ash. He did not immediately go to bed. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the stone floor and observed. At first, warmth radiated clearly from the zone nearest the stove. He placed one hand there, then slowly moved outward. The gradient was gradual, no sharp boundary between hot and cold. Just a slow fading like dusk stretching across land. He lay back, fully, arms spread, cheek pressed against stone. The surface felt gently warm against his skin. Outside, wind roared. Inside, the floor exhaled. Hours passed. The air temperature dropped as expected. His breath became faintly visible when he exhaled near the ceiling. But at ground level, where he slept, the cold did not bite. Near midnight, he rose and walked again across the room. The stones had cooled somewhat, but still held noticeable warmth, enough that bare feet did not flinch. He crouched near the far wall and pressed his palm flat there. Even at the edge of the cabin, where cold seeped through chinks in the logs, the stone had moderated the draft. It did not allow the air to pool in icy pockets the way bare earth once had. He returned to bed without relighting the stove. Before dawn, the temperature outside plunged further still. The freeze tightened its grip like a fist. In neighboring cabins, men rose in the dark, shivering, feeding fires that had died faster than expected. Woodpiles shrank visibly now, stacks no longer tall enough to inspire confidence. Elias woke only once. He stepped onto the stone. Cool but steady. He crouched and placed his palm flat against it. A faint warmth lingered still, not from flame, from mass. When morning light crept across the frosted window, he rose and opened the door briefly to assess the damage. The valley lay buried under deeper snow. Drifts reached knee-height in some places. The creek was nearly silent beneath ice. Henry stood outside his cabin, staring at his woodpile with troubled eyes. Elias watched quietly. After a moment, Henry noticed him. "How much you burn yesterday?" Henry called. "2 small stacks." Henry looked back at his own pile. "I burned near double that." Elias nodded once. Henry hesitated, then trudged across the snow toward Elias's cabin. He stepped inside without speaking. He removed his gloves and placed his hands flat on the stone once more, still warm. He shook his head slowly. "Explain it again," he said. Elias knelt and drew a rough circle in a patch of ash near the stove. "Fire makes heat," he began calmly. "Heat rises. Most of it goes up and out unless something holds it." He tapped the stone. "This holds it." Henry frowned. "But stone is cold." "It starts cold," Elias corrected, "like water starts cold. But boil water long enough, and it stays hot, after you pull it off." Henry's eyes shifted toward the stove, then back to the floor. "So instead of heating air, you're heating this." "Yes." "And this heats the air." "Yes." Henry straightened slowly. He looked around the cabin with new calculation in his gaze. "How long you think it? Do you take to lay something like this?" he asked quietly. Elias considered before answering. "Before deep winter? Too long." Henry grimaced. "But you could start with a section," Elias added, "near the stove." Henry nodded slowly. Outside, the wind continued its relentless push. Inside, the science beneath Elias, as boots worked silently. The stones did not care for pride or mockery. They did not answer to opinion. They responded only to heat, to time, to mass. By the end of that week, 3 men in the valley had begun collecting stones, not openly at first, but quietly. And each evening, when fires burned low and air cooled, they stepped cautiously onto their experimental patches of rock and felt what Elias had known from the beginning. Heat, when given something solid to live in, does not flee so quickly. The storm did not build gradually. It arrived like a wall. The sky had been low all morning, thick and metallic, pressing down on the valley as if the air itself had weight. Snow fell in fine, dry sheets that drifted sideways, never fully settling before the wind took hold again. By noon, the ridges beyond the settlement had vanished behind a curtain of white. Elias stood at his doorway and watched the horizon disappear. He had seen storms before. Back east, winter came hard and stayed long. But this land carried wind differently. Here, it did not simply blow, it hunted. By mid-afternoon, the first heavy gust struck the valley floor with a sound like distant thunder. Snow lifted from the ground in swirling plumes, erasing paths, burying fence lines, softening the edges of cabins until they looked half swallowed. Doors slammed. Voices shouted. Men ran the last armloads of wood from stacks into their homes before the drifts grew too deep. Elias did not run. He stepped back inside and closed the door firmly against the gale. Snow immediately packed itself along the lower seam. The cabin darkened as clouds thickened overhead. Wind rattled the chimney pipe, producing a hollow moan that rose and fell in strange, animal-like tones. He knelt before the stove and considered his woodpile. It was smaller now than it had been when autumn ended. He had burned steadily through the freeze, though not wastefully. Still, storms did not care for careful plans. He selected 3 moderate logs and stacked them beside the stove. Outside, the wind increased. Snow no longer drifted, it flew. It hammered against the cabin walls in sharp bursts, forcing its way into every exposed crevice. Somewhere nearby, a loose shutter tore free and clattered across the hardening ground. Elias lit the stove with practiced efficiency. Flame caught quickly. He had learned the temperament of his wood and iron. He adjusted the damper to allow a slightly stronger burn than usual. A storm of this magnitude demanded deeper storage. The stones beneath his feet began their quiet work. The first hour passed in a haze of sound. Wind howled. Snow struck the roof in relentless waves. The chimney groaned under pressure, yet held firm. By evening, visibility beyond the window had vanished entirely. The world outside no longer existed as landscape, only as force. Elias fed the stove 1 log at a time, maintaining a steady, sustained heat. He did not allow the fire to roar wildly. He knew better now. Intensity alone would not carry him through what was coming. He needed depth. By dusk, a heavy thud struck the cabin, its northern wall. Something large, perhaps a branch, had been torn loose and hurled by wind. The logs shuddered but held. Inside, warmth gathered slowly at ground level. Elias removed his boots and stepped barefoot onto the stone. Already, the area near the stove radiated comfortable heat. Further out, the floor had lost the brittle edge it carried in the morning. It felt alive. A knock came faintly through the roar of wind. Elias froze. Another knock, harder, urgent. He moved quickly to the door and forced it open against the pressure of snow packed high outside. Samuel Reed stumbled inward, face pale, beard crusted with ice, door drifted near shut. Samuel gasped. Had to dig to reach you. Elias barred the door again and guided him toward the stove. Henry S. Fire 1T hold, Samuel said, between breaths. Wind is pulling it straight up the pipe. Burns hot, dies fast. Elias nodded once. Sit. Samuel lowered himself cautiously onto the stone near the stove. He flinched slightly. It is warm, he said in disbelief. Elias handed him a tin cup of water warmed earlier and sat opposite him. Samuel removed his gloves slowly, flexing stiff fingers against the stone surface. How much you burning? He asked. Steady, Elias replied. Samuel looked toward the modest fire in the stove. Doesn't look like much. It doesn't have to. The storm intensified after dark. Wind shrieked down the chimney at intervals, forcing smoke to swirl briefly inside before the draft corrected itself. Snow piled against the door until the lower half was nearly buried. In other cabins, fires roared uncontrollably as men tried to fight wind with flame. Wood disappeared at alarming rates. Samuel rose once to peer through the frosted window. Can't see a foot, he muttered. He paced once, then stopped abruptly. You think it'll last? He asked quietly. The storm? Elias said. No, your wood. Elias glanced at the remaining stack beside the wall. If the stones hold, he answered evenly, the wood stretches. Samuel stared at the floor again. Hours passed. They fed the stove, deliberately never allowing flame to surge too high, never letting it die entirely. The iron glowed steadily, not fiercely. The stones beneath them absorbed quietly. Near midnight, Samuel dozed briefly against the wall. Elias remained awake, listening. The wind had shifted direction. Now it struck the western wall with renewed violence. Snow forced its way through a small crack near the roof beam, drifting down in fine powder. Elias stood and packed additional clay into the seam, sealing it tight. He returned to the stove and added the last of the 3 logs he had set aside earlier. This burn would need to last. He watched the flame take hold, then adjusted the damper until it burned long and low. When the logs settled into embers, he did not add another. He stood barefoot in the dim cabin and tested the floor. Warm, not merely near the stove, across the center. He walked slowly toward the far wall. Even there, beneath the push of wind, the stones retained heat. He lay down flat on his back, staring at the dark beams overhead. Samuel stirred. "You letting it die?" He murmured, "Yes." Samuel pushed himself upright. "It's still howling out there." "It will howl either way," Elias replied calmly. He closed the stove door fully and allowed the final embers to fade. Darkness settled thickly inside the cabin. The only sound was wind. Time passed in long, stretched intervals. The air gradually cooled, but not sharply, not suddenly. The floor beneath Elias, his back remained warm. He could feel it through his shirt. Near dawn, the temperature outside reached its lowest point. The wind finally began to weaken, though snow still fell steadily. Inside, the cabin held an improbable steadiness. Samuel rose first and stepped tentatively onto the stone. He froze in place. "It is still warm," he whispered. Elias stood as well. He pressed his palm flat against the floor near the stove. The warmth was gentler now, but undeniable. Nearly 24 hours since the strongest burn began, and the floor still gave back. Samuel walked slowly across the cabin, testing different spots. "Henry's going to burn through his last stack by noon," he said quietly. Elias moved to the door and forced it open against packed snow. The storm had eased, leaving behind a world reshaped. Drifts rose waist-high between cabins. Fences had vanished entirely. Smoke from chimneys was thin now, some barely visible. Henry stood outside his cabin, staring at an almost empty woodpile half buried in snow. He looked smaller somehow. Samuel stepped out into the drifted yard and waved him over. Henry trudged across slowly, boots sinking deep. He entered Elias' cabin without speaking. His eyes went first to the stove. Cold, then to the floor. He crouched stiffly and pressed his palm flat against the stone, his breath caught. "Impossible," he muttered. Elias said nothing. Henry moved his hand outward, testing farther sections. "Still warm." "How long since you fed it?" Henry demanded. "Last night." Henry stared at him as if the words had struck physically. "Whole night?" He pressed. "Yes." Henry lowered himself fully onto his knees and placed both palms flat against the center of the room. The stones gave back gently, not blazing, not hot, but steady. Henry bowed his head briefly. "I burned near everything," he said quietly. Samuel glanced at the modest stack of wood remaining in Elias's cabin. "Not him," Samuel said. Silence filled the room, heavy but not tense. Outside, the storm's remnants drifted softly across the valley. Henry rose slowly. "How?" he asked finally, not in mockery, not in disbelief, but in earnest. Elias walked to the stove and placed his hand against its cold iron. "I did, to fight the cold," he said evenly. "I fed the floor." Henry looked down again at the river rock beneath his boots. "What would it take," he asked carefully, "to lay this in mine?" Elias met his gaze. "Time," he said, "and patience." Henry nodded once. Outside, men emerged cautiously from cabins, assessing damage, counting what remained. Inside Elias's cabin, warmth lingered, still quiet, proof beneath his feet. The storm had tested every claim in the valley. Wood had burned fast, where it was asked to do everything alone. But stone had remembered, and given back. For nearly 24 hours after the last flame died, the floor had carried him through the coldest night of the storm. The laughter that once followed him to the creek did not return. Instead, that afternoon, 3 men trudged through waist-deep snow toward the river bend with sledges. Not to mock, but to gather. By the time the storm's scars had settled into hardened drifts and the valley resumed something like ordinary life, the laughter was gone. It did not fade all at once. It thinned gradually, like smoke dissipating after a fire has burned out. No one announced its end. No one apologized. But the tone of voices shifted. The sideways glances stopped. Where mockery once lived, calculation took its place. Elias noticed the change not in what people said, but in what they did. 3 mornings after the storm, while snow still crusted hard along fence lines and the creek ran sluggish beneath a skin of ice, Henry Collins appeared at the river bend with a pry bar. He did not greet Elias, who was already there. He simply wedged the bar beneath a broad, flat stone and leaned his weight against it until the rock broke free from the frozen mud. The sound echoed across the quiet valley. Elias said nothing. He only nodded once. By midday, Samuel Reed had joined them. The 3 men worked in silence at first. The only sounds were iron against stone, breath fogging into the air, the scrape of sledges dragged across crusted snow. By afternoon, others came not openly, not as a procession, but in ones and twos. A man might pause to see what they were up to, then crouch and test a rock with his boot. Another would mutter something about reinforcing a hearth and begin selecting smaller stones. No one used the word foolish anymore. The transformation of the valley did not happen overnight. Floors could not be torn up in the depth of winter without risk, but patches began to appear. Henry started near his stove, clearing a square of plank flooring and digging down beneath it despite the frozen ground. He worked slowly, stubbornly, hands raw and knuckles split, but he did not stop. At first, the square looked awkward wood boards surrounding a crude island of stone. The men who passed his cabin shook their heads, not in mockery now, but in uncertainty. Henry did not care. The first night he fed his stove after laying that section, he sat on a stool and waited. The next morning he walked barefoot across that square, and felt something he had not felt before, steadiness. He did not tell anyone immediately. But the next afternoon, 2 more men arrived at the creek with pry bars. Elias watched all of this without pride. He did not consider himself an inventor. The idea had not sprung from nowhere. It had lived in his memory since childhood, shaped by a stone farmhouse and long winter nights back east. He had merely applied what he knew to a new land. Still, as more sledges scarred the snow between creek and cabins, he understood that something had shifted. One evening, as pale winter sunlight filtered through thin clouds, Samuel stood in Elias' doorway and looked around the cabin with open admiration. "You were right," he said simply. Elias stirred the stove and adjusted the damper. "It's not about right," he replied. "It is about staying warm." Samuel laughed softly. "You always answer like that." Elias glanced down at the floor, where stones glowed faintly in firelight. "They laughed," Samuel continued. "Called you slow, wasteful. They did. And now?" Elias shrugged. "Now they haul." Samuel stepped farther inside and crouched to examine the seams between stones. "You think we'll all have floors like this come spring?" "Some will. Most, Elias admitted. Outside, the valley bore new signs of adaptation. Smoke from chimneys was thinner than before the storm. Woodpiles no longer shrank at the frantic pace they once had. Fires burned steadier, lower. Men had begun experimenting not just with floors, but with stone lining along walls, thicker hearth bases, even low benches built of rock near stoves to capture additional warmth. Innovation spread quietly when it proved itself. Late in January, another cold front pushed down from the north. Not as violent as the great storm, but sharp enough to test confidence. This time, the settlement met it differently. Fires were fed deliberately, not desperately. Doors were sealed tight against drafts. Stone patches warmed slowly throughout the afternoon and held through the night. The morning after, no one stood outside splitting wood in panic. Henry crossed the snow toward Elias' cabin before sunrise. He entered without knocking, as he had begun to do. "Held through," he said. "Yes?" Henry nodded. "That square near the stove still warm at dawn." Elias smiled faintly. "It will improve." Henry looked around the cabin once more. "Never thought I'd say this," he muttered, "but I was wrong." Elias met his gaze evenly. "You were cautious," he said. "Caution keeps a man alive, too," Henry snorted. "Not that kind." They both knew the truth. Pride had nearly cost him. Word of the stone floors spread beyond the immediate valley. A trader passing through in early February carried the story eastward to the next settlement over. By midwinter's end, a handful of cabins along neighboring creeks had begun laying stone in sections. No one credited Elias publicly. That was not the way of frontier men. Ideas became communal once proven. Ownership dissolved into practicality. He did not mind. What mattered was what happened on the coldest nights. In March, when another freeze swept unexpectedly through the region and caught several newer families unprepared, those who had laid stone fared better. They shared less wood. Their fires burned lower and longer. Their cabins did not drop to biting cold before dawn. The shift in reputation became undeniable. Where once Elias had walked to the creek alone, now he rarely did so without company. Men asked questions openly. How thick should the base be? What mix you use between seams? How long you burn steady before letting it die? Elias answered plainly without embellishment. Dig down first, he would say. Clay and sand for the bed, flat stones if you can find them. Burn low and long. Let the mass do its work. He did not speak in grand terms. He did not use words like thermal mass or energy retention. He spoke from experience. Stone remembers. By early spring, when thaw began to soften the snow and the creek ran louder again, the valley looked subtly different. Cabin doors stood open more often in daylight. Men knelt on newly exposed earth floors, marking out sections to replace with stone once the ground fully yielded. Sledges moved not through snow now, but through mud, heavy with rounded rocks. Children carried smaller stones in their arms, proud to help. Women, too, noticed the change. Laundry dried faster in steadier warmth. Water buckets froze less often overnight. Even the smell of cabins shifted from sharp smoke saturation to something cleaner, less frantic. One afternoon, as the last ice broke free from the creek, as bent and drifted downstream in slow chunks, Samuel stood beside Elias and surveyed the valley. "Hard to believe," Samuel said, "that it started with them calling you a fool." Elias watched Henry and two others lever a massive flat stone from the bank. "Winter decides what is foolish," he replied quietly. Samuel laughed. "You ever think of what else could be done?" "With stone?" "With thinking ahead." Elias considered that for a moment. "Always," he said. Spring came slowly but surely. Snow retreated into shaded pockets. Grass began to show in dull patches of green. The valley breathed easier. By the time the first true warmth of April settled across the land, more than half the cabins in the settlement had at least a section of river rock floor. The laughter was long forgotten. In its place was something quite a respect not spoken aloud but visible in behavior. When Elias walked to the creek now, men stepped aside to let him pass first. When he spoke about adjustments to stove placement or airflow, they listened. He did not seek authority, but it found him anyway. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in streaks of gold and purple, Henry stood at the doorway of his now half-stone cabin and watched Elias cross the yard. "You ever think about how close we were," Henry called out, to what Elias asked, "to burning through everything in that storm?" Elias nodded once. Henry looked down at the stone beneath his feet. "Funny thing," he said, "all that time we thought you were behind." Elias smiled faintly. "Turns out," Henry continued, "you were ahead." The valley would see many winters after that one, some harsher, some milder, but the lesson endured. Cabins built in later years were constructed differently from the start. Floors dug deeper, stone laid first before boards, stoves positioned with thought rather than convenience. No one called it innovation, they called it common sense. And when newcomers arrived and questioned the extra labor, when they scoffed at hauling heavy rocks instead of nailing quick planks, the older settlers would simply gesture toward the river bend and say, "Ask Elias." He never boasted. He never reminded anyone of the laughter. He simply knelt beside the creek, ran his hand across the smooth back of a stone, and selected the ones that would remember fire best. Because on the frontier, survival did not belong to the fastest builder or the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who understood how to make warmth last.